The uneasy calm in Gaza this week seemed short-lived before the temporary three-day truce was over. Rockets were fired and then the airstrikes began and the death toll continued to rise. It now stands at nearly 2,000, 1,900 of those Palestinians. The impact of the violence has a resonance around the world, and here reverberations are being keenly felt, particularly by the Muslim and Jewish communities. In London, the Tricycle Theatre said it couldn't stage the annual Jewish Film Festival while the organisers continued to receive some funding from the Israeli government. In Edinburgh, 2 Israeli theatre companies cancelled shows at the Fringe Festival because of fears over protests. An increase in the number of the incidents against the Jewish community has also raised concerns.
Well, there certainly has been a connection between what's taking place currently in Gaza and the anti-Semitism that's been felt by the Jewish British community here in the UK. There's generally this kind of visceral and often violent feeling now in and around the Jewish community that if I was physically looking Jewish, I would think twice now about walking around on the street and identifying myself as Jewish.
Muslim groups have also felt the impact of events in Gaza. HSBC wrote to 3 of them saying their accounts would be closed because they're outside what it called the bank's risk appetite. It says the decision is not based on race or religion and was part of an overall review of bank strategy. And all this on the week that the first female Muslim minister, Baroness Varsi, resigned over the government's stance in the region.
Over the last 4 weeks, I have done everything that I can, both at formal meetings and informal meetings, trying to convince my colleagues that our current policy on Gaza is morally indefensible, that it's not in our interests, it's not in British interests, and that it will have consequences for us both internationally and here at home. But in the end, I felt the government's position wasn't moving, and therefore I had to, on a point of principle, resign.
Well, the government has dismissed Baroness Varsi's claims, saying policy has always been consistently clear, supporting a negotiated 2-state solution. I'm now joined in the studio to discuss the situation here in the UK by the Vice President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Jonathan Arkush, founder of the Jewish campaign group Yachad, Hannah Weisfeld, and Ismail Patel, who founded the pro-Palestinian group Friends of Al-Aqsa. Welcome, all of you, to the programme, and thanks for joining us. Jonathan, I just want to start with you. We heard Richard Ferrer, the editor of Jewish News there, saying there's a visceral and violent feeling at the moment towards the Jewish community, and he thinks twice about identifying himself as Jewish in public. Is that commonly felt?
I think it is a feeling that some Jews are experiencing. I'm not, but the level of insecurity and deep concern about the environment around us is greater than at any time that I can remember.
And Hannah, do you think this is an anti-Semitic feeling, an anti-Jewish feeling, or anti-Israeli?
I think it's all of them. I think one of the biggest challenges we've got today is the general public are unable, and I think the Jewish community too, to work out where the boundaries are. Mm-hmm. And consequently, what sometimes is criticism of the Israeli government definitely spills over into anti-Semitism. What people perceive to be anti-Semitism is sometimes just criticism, and there's a lot of unpacking that I think the general British public needs to do as to what is acceptable and what is not.
Yes. I mean, today, if we just look back at what happened, we were just talking about the Tricycle Theatre there, when they took that decision earlier this week to say that it couldn't go ahead because there was still funding from the Israeli government. The Tricycle very keen to say that this is anti-Israeli and not anti-Jewish, and offered to help provide funding themselves to cover for the loss that would be experienced.
I mean, I think the issue with the Tricycle is complex, and I don't agree with those who say it's anti-Semitic. I don't think it's anti-Semitic, and I think the festival wouldn't have the Tricycle wouldn't have hosted the festival for the last 8 years if it was. That said, Israel is a core part of the Jewish community's identity, and if you look at the polling, it says that 82% of Jews strongly identify with Israel, and the Israeli embassy is more than the promotion of a current Israeli government. And so I think, not all, but for the majority of Jews in this country, they felt quite affronted at the notion that they were being told that the state of Israel couldn't play a role in a cultural festival. And some people perceive that to be anti-Semitic. I personally don't, but I think it was misguided.
Okay, before we bring our other guests in, Jonathan, I just want to... Is there division at all within the Jewish community over Israel's actions in Gaza?
Not really. The overwhelming majority of the Jewish community are very supportive of the State of Israel. They're proud of its achievements, proud of its democracy, and concerned about its safety. It's a very tiny country. From Gaza to Tel Aviv is about 40 miles. That's the distance from the top of North London to the tip of South London. That's how insecure Israelis feel, and naturally British Jews empathise with that insecurity. I won't say that every single Jewish person in the United Kingdom or the world thinks exactly the same. Of course they don't. We are a diverse community with a vigorous democracy.
So there is dissent, but you're saying not much. Would you agree, Hannah?
I think there's lots of concern. I think that I agree with Jonathan that the majority of the community is deeply concerned for Israel's security. What I would say is that we, in the space of a week, garnered over 1,000 signatures from rabbis, from community leaders, from people very involved in the community saying, actually, we think there needs to be a ceasefire and that we have to see an urgent return to negotiations and this current round of violence has got to end as quickly as possible. I think there is deep concern about the humanitarian costs on both sides. I think that one of the challenges the community has is that actually how do you come out and say, well, we've got to back peace, that this can no longer be, for those who support the Palestinian cause, those who support the Israeli cause, about backing a football team. This is about how do you get people out and say, this has got to be about us getting behind peace.
Nadia, I want to bring you in here because you wrote an article last year saying anti-Semitism was routine and commonplace amongst British Muslims. Do you think the current conflict in Gaza has made that worse?
Unfortunately, I probably think in some sections of the British Muslim community, as I made very clear in that piece, it's not a majority viewpoint, but it does exist, unfortunately. And obviously the Israel-Palestine conflict doesn't help things. I think that's fairly indisputable. What we've seen in July, I think, is something like 200 anti-Semitic incidents in Britain, the second worst month on record in 30 years. That is a problem. And I think everyone, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, atheist, Christian, we have to get together and think no community, not Muslims, not Jews, not anyone, should be targeted for their faith, should be stereotyped or smeared. And I say, I yield to no one in my defence or my promotion of the Palestinian struggle for freedom and independence. Having said that, we have to be very clear that we cannot, in this country, no one should be blaming, no matter how many. Jonathan makes the point that the majority of British Jews defend Israel. I happen to think they're incorrect in doing so. That doesn't change the fact that British Jews shouldn't be collectively blamed or punished for what Benjamin Netanyahu or the Israeli military is doing in Gaza. We have to not conflate British Jews here with Israeli soldiers there. That's just the starting point of it. Having said that, just one very quick caveat. What we've seen in pro-Palestinian demonstrations so far, and Ismail can speak better than I can on this being involved in them, is even Mark Gardner from the Community Security Trust, which monitors anti-Semitic attacks, has said compared to France, Germany, Holland, where there's been real rampant anti-Semitism in some of these demos, that hasn't been the case in Britain. There have been a few isolated placards, which is a few too many, but let's be very clear, the vast majority of people who are going out, including Jews, to protest against the Israeli behaviour in Gaza are not doing so out of any anti-Semitic intention. We have to be very clear on both sides.
But Ismail, as somebody who attends pro-Palestinian discussions and protests, would you think that sometimes perhaps it does exacerbate the tension between the two communities in this country?
Far from it. I would say totally the reverse. The greatest cheer we get from the podium is when you have a Jewish speaker and the crowd gets to understand the difference between Judaism and Zionism. And this is one thing that has come out very strongly from the podiums and pro-Palestinian organisation in Britain, is the ability to educate the British public the difference between Judaism and Zionism. And I think the conflating point comes when I think certain members of the Jewish community try to insinuate that most of the Jewish people in Britain have an affiliation with the Jewish state. And I think that doesn't help at all. And I think they should be able to also differentiate between what the state of Israel is doing and what the Jewish people here represent.
But Jonathan is saying that most Jews support what the state of Israel is doing.
I would disagree with that. I don't know the statistics or the polls. They may do. But there's a significant number of Jews who walk with us, talk with us, and they're prepared to share the platform with us.
Well, I'm glad to hear Ismail say that anti-Semitism in the Muslim community is unacceptable. Very glad to hear. But he's not right when he says and tries to drive a wedge between what he calls Judaism and Zionism. Look, Zionism is simply the Jewish aspiration to have a homeland for the Jewish people. That's all it is. So let me say straight away, most Jews in this country are extremely proud to be Zionist.
I think the positive message that came from what Ismail was saying, and I don't know whether you would agree with this as well, is that actually you can share the same platform and talk positively about what might be done to find peace. Do you feel the same way?
I do agree, and one of the Muslim representative organisations, the Muslim Council of Britain, put out a statement just a few days ago to say that whatever our differences on Israel-Palestine, they must never be allowed to degenerate into anti-Semitism, and they mustn't be allowed to hurt community relations.
Jonathan, can I ask a question? I spend a lot of time talking to Muslim audiences, student groups, etc. And when the issue of Israel comes up, or if a young British Muslim person were to say, it's the fault of the Jews, and I were to say, and my standard line is, don't conflate Jews with Israelis. Let's not mix the two together. Don't bring anti-Semitism into it. The problem is, do you get, and I understand where you're coming from, I understand the point you're making about the Jewish aspiration, but someone watching at home, it does muddy the water, unfortunately, this debate, where if somebody's sitting at home who doesn't follow the conflict closely, they hear you say, most British Jews defend what Israel's doing, proud of Israel, you shouldn't drive a wedge between Judaism and Zionism. When I then say to them, don't conflate the two, they'll say, well, they're conflating it themselves.
Let me put this to you, Matty. It's a really fundamental point here. Right now, today, in the name of Islam, atrocities are being committed.
Exactly, and I condemn them. I don't say I just said exactly my point.
If I said that muddied the waters,
but it doesn't muddy the waters because most British Muslims don't support
ISIS. All right,
can't be an excuse for
Jonathan, you've made my point for me. Most British Muslims don't defend ISIS.
Hang on.
I just want to come in. I think that what's missing from this conversation is that this is not about driving a wedge between Jews and Zionism. Actually, there is a fundamental misunderstanding about when we throw around the term Zionism, what we're talking about.
Yep.
And actually, the conversation we should be having is actually people's opinions, positions, whatever you want to call it, on actually an Israeli government and their policy.
Agreed.
And that's a very, very different conversation. There are many, many Jews in this country, all the polling of the Jewish community overwhelmingly says this, that don't support certain things the Israeli government does. We don't have any polling about this current conflict. And I think actually it's incredibly important that people see that there is a diversity of opinion.
Okay. Is it quite difficult, though, and you talked about diversity of opinion, is it quite difficult whether you are a Jew or a Muslim at the moment to express that diversity of opinion when you feel as though you are under attack?
Not really. I think people are quite open and they're expressing their views very loudly for everybody to hear, especially from the Jewish community. As I mentioned, we've got very strong support from the Jewish community who are willing to be with us throughout and try and walk the walk of freedom for the Palestinian people.
Are you experiencing the same level of vitriol which Jonathan seems to be suggesting he certainly has heard of in his community, in the Muslim community?
We have heard of it, but I wouldn't specifically put it because of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. There is a shift towards the right-wing politics within Europe and in Britain as well. And EDL, Britain First, all these organizations are trying to bring about racist narrative within the country. And I think we should understand that there's a shift towards the right more than anything else.
Just on the Muslim issue, I mean, my personal view is I would like to debate the subject of Gaza, which we're not actually here to debate. But when we do debate Gaza, I'd like to debate it as a political issue. It frustrates me when the media, when politicians and other people make it a Jewish-Muslim issue. Because obviously Jews and Muslims...
Is it not a religious issue? Do you think it's more about land?
It's not a religious issue for me. No, it isn't. I support the Palestinians just as I would support the Tibetans against the Chinese. I support human rights. And I think, Baroness Varsi resigned on Monday. A fellow Tory immediately tweeted, well, she feels strongly about Muslim issues, as if Gaza is somehow a Muslim issue, not a human rights issue or a humanitarian issue or a geopolitical issue. It's all of those things. Obviously, Muslim Jews feel strongly about it, but it's not a holy war in any sense. I don't believe that's a secular political struggle.
The point is whether it's seen as a religious issue, a political issue, a land issue, it still goes back to whether it's
exploited by religious people on both sides.
And that means,
and
does that increase the amount of alienation that some in the Muslim community are feeling?
It's a simple issue. It's about Israeli occupying Palestinian territory. That's the bottom line. And we have to end that occupation. There is an element of alienation because some Muslims are maybe scared to talk about it because they might be labeled as anti-Semitic, as we've seen talking heads in the media and also institutes like HSBC closing their accounts and so forth. So there is that fear in the background that if we come out, there's a possibility that there will be a repercussion on us. And I think that's we have to overcome that and hopefully try and bring about the differences.
I also think that exists inside the Jewish community. So, we have thousands of supporters. Yachad, the organisation I represent, has thousands of supporters inside the community. It's certainly the case that when the whole thing came out into the media about the tricycle, that a lot of our supporters felt incredibly alienated and really concerned. And these are people that are standing up, from within the heart of the Jewish community and saying, I support a ceasefire. And so I think that, the reality is that I think you're right, that it spills over into the Muslim-Jewish sort of landscape in this country. We all have a job to do, I think, in standing up and supporting peace, speaking out against extremism, and it's incredibly important those voices are heard. So I work with students on university campus, and actually what the students say to us is that we really want a moderate pro-Israel voice on campus, because otherwise the debate is held by extremists on the other side.
On non-Gaza issues, we should say this, on non-Gaza issues, Muslim Jews work very closely together.
Yeah,
Jonathan wrote an excellent piece alongside the Muslim Council of Britain's head about the defence of kosher and halal meat. We have a lot of things in common, and we can't be held hostage to the Gaza conflict.
Allow me to sum up, if I may, as well, which is this point where, when you mention peace and that all communities, whether Jewish, Muslim, should work together to try to find peace, and all of you nodded, which I think you all agree, and I think that's a good place to...
the Middle East conflict into the
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Let's move on to our special guest this week. She was a code breaker for naval intelligence